Good afternoon, everyone. It is Friday afternoon. It's the final Friday of the month. I'm not sure why I had to think about that there. It is the 1500 hours in the UK, which means it's time for PMI Live. This week, episode 89, with myself and Richard Seddon and my colleague, where are you? You're down there. Damion Albinson.
Welcome.
Many of you know Damo, and I'll get him to introduce himself shortly and also tell us a bit of what he's been up to. So we haven't seen him for many an episode. So both of us are flying together here today with the session, which as usual is a fairly interactive one. We're going to be using the Miro whiteboard system, which we'll share the links, etc. to. Welcome to all of those of you who are joining us on our live streams on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Facebook. If you want to join in and be part of the webinar, there's still a chance you can hop on over to the website at pmi.co.uk and you can register there and you can join and interact within the webinar itself and use the Miro board as well. As usual, we will be sending out voice of the customer surveys once we have finished. And we're actually at the point where we're forming up the second half of the year's schedule. And we're looking to you to help us form that. We have June and July is currently programmed in, but beyond there, we're looking at you. So when we do get that voice of the customer survey, let us know which topics you'd like us to focus on. They can be anything, and then set us the challenge and we'll turn it into one of our PMI Live interactive webinars. So Damo, as I mentioned earlier on, we haven't seen you for a bit. What have you been up to?
Oh, all sorts. You've been keeping me busy, Rich. So yeah, I've had a really interesting 6 months. I think it's been right about that long since I was last on. So I've been delivering quite a bit of our public and in-house training courses, both yellow belt and green belt level. I've been doing an extensive piece of work with one of our clients to support the development of their people around an operational excellence program that they've got running. So I've been helping them to make sense of some of the principles and elements of how that works. It's really fascinating conversations about how different processes need to feed in to support the sort of the real doing end of their business. So I've had some really, really nice insights from that. And the other piece of work I've been on recently is developing some of our internal products for PMI for our new mode of training availability, which we're going to talk to the audience about, I think, at the end of today's webinar.
Look at this. I didn't even have to prime that link into him either. Excellent. Well done. You've been listening to the briefings. Good news. Damo, do you want to take us through the content for today? I mean, the subject matter is rapid problem solving, of which there's a plethora of tools. So rightly so, some people have been asking, why is this necessary? Why this topic? Why now? So do you want to give us a bit on that and also take us through what you're going to cover?
Yeah, I think problem solving is something that all organizations are going to be constantly facing into, big or small. And I think there's so many tools around it. There's so many different methods and different names given to it. And I just thought it was worth us exploring, what some of those look like, and maybe making sense of maybe how different and similar some of the different methods are and techniques. So people are in a position, certainly if they're maybe just starting out with doing it or considering introducing it into their daily practice, to make sense of that big landscape that might otherwise look quite confusing and complicated.
Mm-hmm. And I should say as well, Damo, that as we work through the webinar, anyone either on the live streams or in the live webinar can contribute through the chat and also through the Q&A. If you have some of these tools that you use and they're working or they're not working for you, or you'd like Damo's insight here, it's Friday afternoon ahead of a long weekend. We like to set him a challenge, so keep him on his toes and put your questions to him as we go through. Use those functions, and we look forward to hearing from you. Same in the Miro board as well, as that throws up some thoughts as well. Do let us know how this fits your context and your problems.
Okay, very good. So hopefully my slides sharing okay.
They certainly
I seem to have lost my green background. Okay, so what I want to explore then through the whole section is I'm going to start out by getting us to think about, what is a problem? How would we define that? What different definitions are out there in terms of people's thinking about it? We're then going to explore, as you've said, the tools and Yeah, see what sort of tools other people are familiar with. There might be things way beyond even things that I've come across before. And then, of course, the age-old challenge: how do we select the right one? If we've got all these different options. So I'm going to talk to you a bit of guidance, really, about how I would think about doing that. And then I'd like to take you through a genuine problem-solving case study, which is something that happened in my house recently. So I'm going to talk you through that so we can explore some of the elements of how problem-solving can work. And then finish off talking about how what to consider if we want to develop a standardized method for problem solving in our businesses. Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good.
Okay. So as I said, the first thing I'd like to do is propose a question to the audience. And I'm going to take you on to Miro in a moment and get you actively involved in this. But whilst I'm talking through that, have a think about this question. And it's fairly straightforward. How would you define a problem in, I guess, a business context? So what we'll be looking for is not examples of specific problems that you've encountered, because I'm sure we could have a pretty long list there, but rather, how would you define what a problem is in sort of everyday language? So that's the question to be thinking about. So we're going to use Miro. I'm just going to very quickly take people through the basic operations of it whilst Rich is preparing to share a link with you. So this
should
is
be in the chat now. Damion, just give
perfect.
everyone a sec to get in there, first of all, if you would.
Yeah. No
So there's two things I'm doing. One, the link is in there, and you will require a password, which is also in the chat. So any problems? I always breathe a sigh of relief when I start seeing cursors appear in the Miro board in these sessions.
Yeah.
You don't have to enter your name. It may prompt you to enter your name, but you don't have to do that. Great news, I can see people are getting in, so those appear to be working. So click the link, enter the password, and Damo will give you a run through now.
So we're going to start on this template that's been set up on the left-hand side, which has the title in there, how would you define a problem? So if you're too zoomed out, you can zoom into the board closer by using these controls in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a plus minus there. You might have a mouse with a scroll wheel. You can also use that. And if you navigate yourself to one of these yellow sticky notes that we have on the board, I can see people are writing already. If you double click on one of those, it becomes active, and then you can just type away and we should be able to see the text that you've written. If you do happen to make a mistake and maybe drag something that you didn't want to move or delete someone else's sticky note, just come over here to the left-hand side, and there's an arrow that's kind of pointing to the left. That's the undo command, or you can press Control Z. So we'll just give everyone a little bit of time to jot down some thoughts.
Maybe a couple of minutes. Damo, it's also worth talking about the kind of thing you're not looking for here. So I'm right in thinking you're not looking for examples of problems, are you?
No, we don't want specific examples of problems because they could be far too variable for, I think, for us to really make much sense of. So yeah, we're rather looking for a definition of how would you define a problem to anyone else. What's your chosen words to best capture what a good definition is of a typical problem?
Although looking at how astute the audience obviously is today on PMI Live, no explanation needed. Everyone's bang on message and putting in entirely appropriate responses. So thanks for that, folks. Looking good. So there's no right or wrongs with this. Just, let us know how you would define a problem, be it in your business or elsewhere.
Okay. So interesting.
Give you another minute or so, and then we'll start talking them through.
Yeah.
Okay, so piling in, aren't they? Excellent. Also, if anyone does have any problems with Miro, could you let us know in the chat as well? Because the last PMI Live we ran, people did, and we weren't aware of it until after the event. So if you are unable, just let us know in the chat in the main session, which is available as Neil has enabled it.
Okay, some lovely definitions coming out.
Excellent. So do you want to start jumping through some of these then, Damo, yeah?
Yeah, sure. So what we've got, we've got something that we don't know how to do. I think that's quite an interesting one we can reflect on. Something that needs to be amended or improved. So indeed, certainly if the desire to do it is high enough, we'll get into that as well. Yeah, something not being right. Process isn't meeting expectations. That's very relevant to the next slide I have. Yeah. Something creates frustration, causing waste. Very good. something that deviates from perfection. That's nice, isn't it? I like the idea there that we've got this pursuit of being perfect. Is a great mindset to keep. Issues that needs to be dealt with, yeah. Difficult thing that is causing unrest amongst people who work in the area. Yeah, that's true, isn't it? In terms of the sort of the emotional impacts that, I'm thinking more on the frustration side of when everything feels like it's going wrong all the time. That can really kind of drag people down. Unwanted outcome, yeah, issue that impacted something. Yeah, there's nothing been written here that I would disagree with. I don't think in terms of a typical definition. So yeah, great.
That's good news. That also suggests something about the kind of participants we've got today.
This
looks like they're all pretty informed. So let's give this a shot then, Damon, shall we?
Yeah, sure. All right. So let me get back onto my slides then. Okay, so we've obviously got our definition that we're happy to be challenged on. So we've got a couple, in fact. So a problem is a deviation from an expected condition or unwanted effect whose cause is not yet known. So that pretty much sits neatly with what everyone's been just putting down on the Miro board. And of course, problems can manifest themselves in a whole range of ways. And what we often first come across is not necessarily the actual problem, but perhaps the symptom, something that's being generated as a consequence of a problem hiding away elsewhere. And that's quite an important thing to be aware of when we're talking about problem solving, because resolving symptoms alone usually doesn't really lead to any kind of sustained long-term gain. And then we've got some definitions here about the way in which problems can appear. So one type of problem could be where it's been a gradual deterioration from a target condition. They're quite tricky, really, because of the gradual nature. Sometimes, unless we've got the right mechanisms in to detect that kind of thing, it might kind of creep up on us. The other one, of course, is the abrupt. We're sailing along quite nicely, and then suddenly we find ourselves in a place we don't want to be, or a condition we don't want to be in. But the third one, which I thought was really quite interesting, is perhaps it could be the condition where we've never been at the target condition. And therefore that could be defined possibly as a problem. And actually, I think that we're going to circle back around these later on and explore why they are relevant, which leads me into my next slide. So,
and Damo, just before you do jump into that slide, folks, we will be using Miro again. So if you just want to reduce it down for now, and we're back in with Damo's slides at the moment, and then keep it open. But if you have closed it, you can reuse the link. Sure. Thanks for the feedback from a couple of you who have mentioned you had some problems. We are working on that now.
Okay, very good. Okay, so problem solving.
Sorry, Damo, I am destroying your running order today. Just poignant here. Got an observation first in, straight on the chat. So the comment is, and this is from Francisco, thank you very much. I find the third one is the most common in business processes where there are no metrics or meaningless metrics. Does that resonate with your experience?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because if there's no metrics, how do we know we're not where we want to be? I guess you could use anecdotal information, I suppose, for that. Yeah, I mean, I suppose sometimes I think when it comes to problems, sometimes we're aware of something that isn't how we would want it to be, but we struggle to justify that, particularly if you don't have the right measures or metrics. That can make life quite challenging, really, because it's very difficult then, especially for the senior leadership team, to say, well, how on earth are we supposed to prioritize? Are you just another voice of somebody that wants change? And we've got several other people facing in a different direction. So that's quite,
yeah. And I think it's that just reminding me of some of the Miro comments there around perfection. It's where perfection is an unmeasured aspiration. And I think that's where this kind of thing plays in, isn't it? So that target line is not necessarily a fixed number or fixed measure. Don't know where you are today in relation to it. You just know you need to be perfect, which simply isn't good enough, is it?
Indeed, yeah. I suppose there's another flip side to that as well, where if targets being set in a maybe a quite a more of a haphazard way rather than a more scientific based way, that could be leading to the fact that we've got these, overly ambitious targets that cause us to feel like we can never get there. So that's another aspect, I suppose.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. So problem solving versus improvement, are they perhaps two sides of the same coin? Or are they different? And I'm going to use that classic sort of answer of, well, it depends. But here's but I will make sense of that later on. So there's a quote here from Deming that said, stamping out fires is a lot of fun, but it only really puts things back to the way they were. So question mark, that doesn't sound like improvement if we're just maintaining the status quo. And I think he's specifically talking there about the firefighting mentality that we often find ourselves in, where we're running around, probably actually resolving symptoms rather than actually truly problem solving. And I believe that the purpose behind many of the problem solving methods and some of the tools is designed really to go beyond that, to go beyond just getting us back to the status quo. And so we'll take a look at what I mean by that, I think, when we get into the case study a little bit later on in this section. So the next thing I want to look at then are the tools that are available to help support and guide us through problem-solving endeavors. And last month's webinar, episode 88, was also related to problems, called Pinpoint Your Problems. So hopefully most of you had a chance to take part in that one. If you didn't know, you can get to that through our website. Here's a QR code that will take you through to that. But what they did in that session is they generated a list of problem-solving tools that people are familiar with. So I'm going to share that with you now back on the Miro boards. And what we'd like you to do, just have a quick read through these. If I just get to the right bit of the board. There we go. So on the green,
bring to me as well, Damion, while you're there.
Oh yeah, yes, I will. So on the green backgrounds, this is the outputs. And I think what you did in that webinar, Rich, you were on that one, is they then grouped these together. They sort of affinitized them. So what have we got? We've got things like PDSA, waste walks, Gemba walks. People have mentioned that idea of identifying waste. They've got things like the 5Y, a very, very common technique in problem solving. Is not analysis, 8D, RCA, which is an acronym for root cause analysis. Fishbone diagrams, again, another very fairly classic technique in problem solving. What we've got down the bottom, idea generation, chartering, DOE's design of experiments, a very sophisticated technique, and so on. So there's just a handful of some of the more maybe common tools, some of these probably even arguably techniques or methods. Any additional tools then for our audience? Has anyone used problem-solving tools that aren't featuring on this list? And if you want to drop those onto these orange sticky notes onto this space, and we'll just see what we get. And we might require people to help us understand some of them if we don't recognize them. So we'll see.
Yeah, we didn't think of that contingency.
We didn't think of that. No.
Sorry, I've got ChatGPT open. We'll be fine.
Yeah, perfect. So force field analysis, I've come across that before in sort of strategic work. PCD is, I guess, the problem context diagram. I think that might almost certainly is someone that's been on our Greenbelt training. Talking about that. Chaining, yes, there we go. So chaining was a technique that was employed in one of the businesses I worked in before I joined PMI.
Okay.
As a very sort of very reliant on a statistical approach to identifying, root cause and coming up with optimal conditions for the problem to be resolved. Often featuring that design of experiments technique and hypothesis testing.
So look at this then. So we've got them more tools piling in, and this was after a webinar that was dedicated to identifying tools. So that's fascinating. So we've got 6 hats been added as well. The change point analysis, data stratification, factors tree analysis, fast fail. Really, really interesting. And for me, what this does, Damo, is reinforce the challenge of choosing the right tool.
Absolutely.
For the right problem is as important as knowing how to use a tool.
Yeah.
And here's the risk, is it not? If you don't know how to choose the tools and in what context, all problems start to look like a nail when you're equipped only with a hammer.
Indeed. Yeah, this is it. I know, and I'm sure if we had more time, we could probably double or triple this list, with even more exotic tools and techniques. So, of course, to the untrained, it could suddenly start to feel like this is a bit of a minefield. How am I supposed to know what to use and when to use? And so we're going to try to offer some words of wisdom or guidance on that endeavor in the next part of the section. Yeah. So yes, lots and lots of different techniques. Some of these, in fact, I don't think I've used myself before. So there we go. And I've been doing this stuff well over 20 years. So
Brilliant.
yeah, that's a point in itself. Okay, thank you very much, audience, for providing those. So when and how to select the right tool then. So what I've tried to do here is, from my experience of using various different problem-solving methods over the years, is kind of break it down to their basic constituent parts. So problem solving, of course, involves some degree of being able to identify the problem or symptom in the first place. That's, of course, the starting point for any method. And what I've done is listed underneath that title there is some of the tools that I think are usually very helpful in doing just that. However, what I will say is that the tools I've listed are not exclusively used in just problem solving. Some of them are far broader.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the ones that help us identify the problem in the first place. So we've got things like visual management, or using KPIs or metrics, as the audience member said in the last question. Process confirmation as a method of confirming the condition of or health of our processes internally. That might highlight that we have abnormalities. Control charts, for those that are familiar with that, or statistical process control, are a great way to differentiate the difference between expected variation versus unexpected. We have things like process mapping techniques. Generating data from our customers, both external and internal, can help to identify gaps between where they expect things to be versus current state. Gemba walks, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on, which is going to the actual place where the work happens and making observations. Value stream mapping, capability analysis, there's a whole raft of stuff. We then move into identifying the root cause. So any problem solving method is going to require us to try and see beyond the symptom and get down to what was the real fundamental trigger that kickstarted this whole chain of events. So we've got PDSA up there. That shouldn't surprise anyone of our audience that's been on these webinars before. You'll know that in PMI we talk about that a lot, and for good reason. I'll talk about that later. 5 whys analysis is a very classic technique to assist with getting to root causes. Going to Gemba, we've got there again. The cause and effect diagram, the good old fishbone diagram, is a great technique for generating lots and lots of theories, especially in a team environment where the source of a problem might not be so obvious. And then there's a few analysis techniques that can fall off the back of that technique that can help us to validate some of these theories we generate about, where is this cause coming from? What caused this problem? So things like scatter diagrams, or if you're familiar with it, the more advanced technique of regression, Pareto style charts. Hypothesis testing is an extremely broad slice of statistics that can help us to see if the numbers validate or disprove something. Is not analysis is a very usually seen in one of the methods called 8D, where it makes a comparison between what is happening versus what is not happening. And the benefit of doing that is that it can help us to find theories that are maybe not true, or conditions that can't be true given the evidence that we're presented with about the problem we're investigating. Fault tree analysis, I think someone mentioned that on the last exercise. And this 5Ws 1H is a series of questions which help again to try to put as much information on what's actually happened as possible to help us again start to rule out certain theories early on. So, who was involved, what's happened, where did it occur in the process, when did it occur, and how did it happen, and how much. They can really help us sometimes to close down certain avenues. It looks like we've got another question, Rich.
Yeah, it's actually an observation for me, and then a question after that. Oh, I heard a comment actually. So I think what's interesting with this slide, as I focus on it, it's the tools are one thing, aren't they? But I think those three blocks you've identified across the top, and hopefully you agree with me on this, but tell me if you don't. One of the things I see in my client practice is people confusing those with each other, or not being cognizant of which stage they are actually at. And I often liken this to humans being natural born problem solvers, and therefore we love a solution and we jump straight into solution, not identifying solutions, but fixing the thing. And I know your case study is going to deal with that, but I just wanted to emphasize, if people are to look at these, the tools, there's loads of detail. We're not here to educate you about every single one of these tools today. It's about that top piece on this slide. Be cognizant of where you are in these three stages. Are you trying to identify what the problem is? Are you trying to identify the root cause of it? Are you trying to identify the solution? And that will help you immediately narrow down that funnel to focus on which tools are appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, it's understandable, isn't it? We're in a business, there's priorities, everyone's busy, there's all kinds of pressures and priorities, and it's no wonder that there's the temptation to just dive to a solution, especially when people are very experienced, they've been there a long time, and our egos get in the way. Something goes wrong, oh, it's bound to be this thing, and they just go off and change it. And of course, the downside is, of course, often those are not correct. And then we end up changing something that actually wasn't part of the problem at all. And now that change may have introduced yet another problem. So we've actually made the situation even worse, or at best probably wasted a lot of time and sometimes investment too.
Yeah, indeed.
I've seen that happen.
So a couple of comments come in, Damo. One from Blossom. FMEA is, of course, an advanced technique. When PDPC fails, contingency analysis is also a great place to start, as is when mistake proofing has failed in terms of getting a grip on the source of a problem.
Yep.
And then second one from Stuart. He's found in his career that it's very common not to spend enough time describing the problem. Boy, oh boy, oh boy.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think we did that in stereo then. Yeah, I mean, I think I've got this on a slide coming up actually about saying now they do say that defining the problem well is actually half the battle of solving it. And not spending enough time being clear enough on that can actually damage your ability to be able to do a successful problem solving investigation. Simply because if the definition's too ambiguous, it can lead into too many kind of false avenues, and it could actually send you way off from where you should have gone. So there's definitely a lot of skill and discipline, I think, required in doing proper structured problem solving, in spite of those environmental conditions I've mentioned about what we find ourselves in a typical business with pressure and time and all of that. So yes, there's definitely something about picking and choosing which problems do we go after, which ones really require this structure, because we can't use it on everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Damon.
So yes, a bunch of stuff to help identify the root cause, and then finally, of course, identifying a solution. Again, we've got PDSA there, because we should always validate the fact that a solution we've come up with might not necessarily work in practice. Mistake proofing, which I think is a fantastic little bit of theory to help teams come up with better, more robust solutions, rather than just kind of patching over a problem and just so we can get to the end of the week. There's lots and lots of techniques under this title of idea generation. And then there's a few quality type tools as well, affinity and interrelationship diagrams. I think Warren talked about that recently in one of his webinars, and design of experiments again. I'm very conscious that I've just thrown an awful lot of a long list of tools and techniques at people there. But what I would like to add is PMI's ever-growing knowledge hub, which is a feature on our website now, a repository of videos, particularly a series called The Uncommon Sense. And I think we did a bit of a praise of these, didn't we, Rich? And pretty much most of these that I've listed here are indeed covered by our Uncommon Sense podcast series. If not, then they're due to come out in May also, that cover off some of these more techniques. So we're going to reference you back to that at the end as well. So if any of these are interesting, or maybe things that you haven't seen before, absolutely go and have a look at those videos. They're very short 15 minutes segments that give you a good feel for how these things work.
Yeah, we'll share, as Damo says, we've got a slide on that later. We'll give you a QR code and the web address so you can jump on over and discover that, and also subscribe.
Yep. Okay, so we got into talking there, in fact, about the actual developing an approach or a method in order to make these things work. So what I want to do to bring that to life is talk you through a bit of a case study. So a few points to add before I get into this. For those that have been on a training course with me in the past, you'll know that I often talk about my everlasting house
Let's say, how long in
refurbishment
the past,
project.
Damo? How long are we
Well,
talking? What kind of time band?
it's been going on for 10 years. So
I had no idea.
it is a very big project, so I'll add that much. Hence why there's still exposed brick and very grubby light switches kicking around and no plaster being on walls, that kind of thing. This is one of the last areas of the house to be finished, by the way. The problem was this: I was on my way to bed after a long day and went to switch on the light for the stairs, downstairs at least. This is a two-story building, so very common to have a two-way light control there. You've got a switch at the bottom of the stairs and one at the top, so you can turn it back off when you get upstairs. Went to turn the light on and nothing happened. Yeah, the bulb didn't light at the top of the stairs. And that was by switching the switch downstairs. So we're saying, well, what could be the cause of that? You'd think, well, there's probably some obvious ones and maybe some less obvious ones. So if anyone wants to put any suggestions in the chat, I'm sure Rich can shout those out for us. But it could have been a bunch of things, right? So it could have been, maybe I've had a power cut. Maybe actually the whole street's lost power, and that's why none of my lights would work, not just the stairs light. It could be something like the bulb was blown, because they don't last forever, these incandescent bulbs. It could be that there's some other cause of loss of power. Maybe the fuse is blown. Maybe the circuit for that particular area of the building is tripped. There's a whole bunch of potential causes. Maybe it's something even more sinister than that, like water ingress somewhere, or maybe the wiring snapped somewhere in the walls or in the ceiling or something. So there's a whole bunch of potential reasons. Some may be more likely than others. And of course, it requires us to do some level of investigation.
And as Damo is chatting through this case study from his 10-year refurbishment, do pop your comments in the chat. I can see we've already got some suggestions here, Damo. Perhaps the wiring should have been done differently.
Right, indeed. Well, so I do know that the house was rewired, I think, back in 2009 before I bought it. So it's not like it's the really old-fashioned stuff that was taken out. Which was terrible, by the way. Some of it was left downstairs and it just snapped as soon as you bent it. Really, really dangerous stuff. So, yeah, the wiring was, well, it could have still been that though, but a good theory. So what did I do to start investigating this? Well, the first thing I did is considered maybe we've had a power cut. Well, the first giveaway there is I could see the street lights still streaming through the front door glass. So suspected that wasn't the case. And I could also very quickly hear the fridge buzzing away in the kitchen, the pump running. So I knew that I had power coming into the property. So I suspected it probably wasn't a power cut. I then went upstairs and tried the other switch just in case it was that. And in fact, before I carry on and talk about the other things I checked, we just want to flag a bit of a disclaimer here that says we're not encouraging anyone to go poking around with your electrics in your homes. It can be very dangerous. And it was taken from the health and safety executive that they're pretty much saying don't mess around with electrics unless you're competent to do so. What I will add is I do have a basic qualification in household wiring. I'm not an electrician, but I do have a qualification, so I know what to touch and what not to touch. I do have some safety equipment too. So please don't go poking around with electrics. So I checked the upstairs switch first and concluded that also wasn't working either. Okay, so that didn't really further my investigation on much because it could be that maybe both switches aren't working. So the next thing I thought, well, it's probably the bulb. Okay, so now if I jump to conclusions here, I might have gone out to the shops, bought a new replacement light bulb, come back, put that in. If I'd have done that, it would have failed because when I took the bulb out and placed it into a different fitting in a different room upstairs, the bulb was fine. The bulb was working okay. And I'll come back to that check in a moment, because what we've actually done there is quite, well, not super sophisticated, but in problem solving terms, it is. So I then went to check the fuse box, or the consumer unit as we call them. And there's a number of things that could have happened inside this. Most properties have these kinds of devices now. I know mine's not exactly the most modern, but it is to regs. So firstly, the master power switch, which is the red one, was on. So again, I hadn't lost power. I also could check the individual circuit breaker for the lighting circuit. So my upstairs and downstairs lighting circuits have their own breaker, and that wasn't tripped. And there's also something called a residual current circuit breaker, which is stopping a leak to earth across a whole range of circuits. And that was also in the on condition, so that hadn't tripped either. So it definitely wasn't a loss of power. So now I know two things. I know the bulb works, I know the switches don't work, and I know that I've got power going to that light socket. And of course, we know that light bulbs need power in order to light up. So I continued my investigation. The other thing I determined as well is that all of the other lights, both upstairs and downstairs, were also still working. So it was just this one fitting. It wasn't like the circuit was broken. So that kind of ruled out the fact that it could be probably most of the wiring, but not necessarily all of it. So finally, after I did a little bit more digging, I discovered that behind the upstairs switch, one of the wires had become detached from its terminal. And so I've tried to sort of take a picture of it there. It's quite difficult. So I've taken a bit of a zoomed in view, so you can see the bare copper very obviously sticking out there. And I will add that at this point, that circuit had been isolated, so there was no risk of me getting a nasty shock. So of course, the solution's pretty simple, right? Put that wire back in, which I did, turn the circuit back on, and it's problem solved. The light's working again. Light is working again. But a question. So after reattaching this wire and establishing that we had light on the stairs again, which was great, the question is, have we improved? So maybe yes, you could say we've improved. We now have lighting back. We didn't have it before. You could also say no, because actually, and this takes us back to these models of problems, all we've really done here is we've had an abrupt change in performance. You know, we had a condition where the light worked fine, suddenly it wasn't working, and after a bit of investigation, we've got it working again. So we haven't reached a condition that's any better than the condition we had in the first place. We haven't improved. However, if we stopped at the point where we just reattached the wire, that would be true. You could argue all we've really done is set ourselves, we've hit the reset button, we're back where we started. But what if we go a little bit further? And this is, I think, often where, even if people are following a structured method, sometimes we might stop too soon before we've asked some deeper questions. So I continued to ask, why had that wire detached? Because it's not normal for them to do that. Well, the cause of that was fairly obvious. So this is a picture of the landing where that switch is located. You'll notice that the switch is hanging off the wall. Now, that wasn't just because I'd gotten around the back to investigate. It had actually been hanging off the wall like that for several weeks, because I'm just about to start decorating that area. So it's always a neater job if you remove the face plates, so you can get your paintbrush behind there. But maybe it's down to my poor planning. But what I'd actually done is moved into the room at the very back there, which is my office, and was decorating that as a priority over the other rooms. In order to do that, I had to move my bookcase onto the landing because there wasn't anywhere else for it to go. This meant that I now had this extremely narrow gap to keep passing through over the next few days. And of course, what happened is I disturbed that switch often enough by brushing past it that had caused that wire to become detached. So now I'm in a position to say, can I improve the process such that it's really unlikely that that problem will come back? And so there's several things I could do there. One is that I could move that bookcase somewhere else. But the other one, probably more importantly, is don't leave that fascia plate hanging off the wall until such a time as maybe I'm just about to paint. So maybe I was getting a little bit too ahead of myself there, too optimistic perhaps. So, and I think that's kind of in parallel with internal problem solving that people do. They sometimes get to the point where they've technically found a solution, but haven't thought beyond the conditions that maybe led to that failure in the first place.
And then we're surprised when the problem reoccurs in future.
And then it's all over. It all has to start again. Indeed, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are the characteristics that enabled us to solve that relatively straightforward problem? Well, the first one, as we said, we didn't jump to a solution. You know, I didn't rush off down the shops and buy a new light bulb and waste some cash, realizing that actually that wouldn't have solved it. So we remain disciplined to a method that says we want to go and keep checking things. We went to the actual location of the problem and made observations and were able to look at the facts and determine what was really going on. So they often refer to that as going to Gemba, going to the real place. There was a degree of knowledge required, even something as basic as, you know, a simple circuit for a light in a house, but you still needed to have some background knowledge about how that works. For instance, if I didn't know that there was such a thing as a fuse box, would I have ever even gone and checked those conditions? You know, because I wouldn't know they were there. So I think if you're going to do internal problem solving, you need to have a process sitting behind it that ensures that it involves the right people who have that knowledge, because they can obviously ask or help to develop better theories about where we should focus and look. And that should mean that you're more likely to pinpoint the root causes quicker than if you were just, maybe just haphazardly guessing. And we verified theories with evidence. But actually, we did something even more sophisticated than that. We disconfirmed certain theories. So, for instance, the light bulb, you know, the practice of taking it out and putting it in a different light socket meant that we could demonstrate that it wasn't a blown bulb, right? So we disproved the theory that it was the bulb just being worn out that caused the issue. And that can get quite sophisticated in problem solving, but it's a really super powerful mindset to have. How do we come up with theories in the first place? And then how do we go about showing that they're not true? And that can really help us to probe in the right areas and check the right things. It also comes back to those questions you can use, those, when did it happen? What happened? Where in the process? When did it occur? Sometimes the answers to those questions can also immediately disprove certain theories. So let me give a simple example. You might say we've had a massive quality issue that's just happened in the last week, and someone's theory is, maybe it was the new staff we've just taken on. Perhaps, they're not familiar with the process yet. They've caused that quality issue. But you say, hang on a minute, we took that new staff on 6 weeks ago. So if it was the new staff, why haven't we seen that problem up until only last week? Yeah, so you could start to shut down certain avenues of inquiry. And what we didn't do is conclude the investigation too prematurely. So we didn't just stop at the fact that, we found a loose wire, simple, put it back in, carry on. Because if we'd have done that, it might have been several more days and I'd have knocked the switch back off again. So yeah, continuing to pursue until we get down to something more fundamental.
A nice point put in the comments here by Richard. In early stages, the emphasis should be on question storming rather than brainstorming.
I think that's a great bit of advice. Yeah, I like that. And we didn't attempt to blame the operator. Well, there was only me to blame, I guess, in this one. But I'm going to circle back around to that one later on in terms of my conclusion. But again, it comes back to a mindset thing. I think it's always really easy to conclude that it's just an operator error. Yep. And our belief in PMI is that 99.9% of people actually come to work to do a good job. It's far healthier for a number of reasons to think about the underlying process and how that's led to the manifestation of what we're now calling a problem or a symptom. And if you keep that mindset, you're more likely to not only find the real cause, but also people are going to engage with that. Operators will engage in an investigation into a process because it doesn't apportion any blame. If you're going around as like a witch hunt, and we're just looking for who we can pass the buck to, well, then people will start to lie and hide things and not engage in that way. Sorry, Rich.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that, Damo, as well, doesn't it? I mean, I have this gives me a perfect opportunity to express it. I have a deep suspicion of any problem-solving methodology that doesn't involve those that operate the process.
Yeah.
And you would be astonished that there are structured problem-solving methodologies out there that explicitly require the people that are working in the process to be removed from the problem investigation.
Yeah.
This kind of translation of that into criminal law and criminal activities that just does not wash well in the vast majority of settings. And I've yet to find one in charity or commercial sectors where that is appropriate.
Yeah.
When you're investigating problems, you need the people that run the process to be part of it. Otherwise, you're bound to have the problem reoccurring.
Yeah. And of course, they miss out on the learning,
Sure.
which is another
Absolutely.
really important aspect. So this is a bit of a crude model, but it's just describing that where would structured problem solving start and end versus other techniques. So if we take this idea of how long it might take to resolve the issue, there's the bottom axis and the vertical axis being how complex is the problem, which is difficult to know sometimes until you get in there. So at the bottom left-hand corner, we've got the stuff we call it just do it. It's a very simple issue. There's a painfully obvious solution, and you just get on with it. You don't need to launch into a structured problem solving. You forget your password to your laptop. You have to make a phone call to IT and get it reset. You're not going to launch into a structured team-based problem-solving endeavor to get that solved. What I would flag on that, though, is these just do it. If they keep repeating very often, maybe you should take the time out to do structured problem solving, because those micro losses can actually massively eat away at our time capacity in any business. So yeah, if you're getting lots and lots of repeats, maybe it is time perhaps to treat that more seriously. But in the middle there, we've got a huge range of complexity and time-based issues that lend themselves well to a structured problem solving approach. But structured problem solving does reach a point where it also doesn't become the most appropriate method. When complexity gets high enough, you probably then do start wandering into what we would call chartered improvement projects, which again require a different methodology to this maybe structured problem solving technique. Usually because of the size and complexity of the problem, and also the fact that you're more likely now to have to involve several people from different functions. It might require sponsorship, and the risks associated to it are much larger. But if we look at the problem solving space, I've listed out some of the techniques that I think are probably most common. So we've got something called the 3 C's, which often relates to a concern, i.e. the problem. Containment being, what do we do immediately to stem the bleed, to stop the problem getting worse? Doesn't solve it, but it stops it getting worse. And then countermeasure being, okay, what's going to be the long-term fix? The assumption with that method is that there's an investigation squeezed in there between the second 2 C's, which can get missed. It can cause people to jump to conclusions. 8D, which was, I think, developed in the automotive industry, stands for 8 disciplines. So it breaks the whole structure down into 8 very precise steps that you go through, which again relate back to that model I shared earlier on about, identify the problem, do some level of investigation to get to cause, and then come up with some kind of robust fix. Some people just call it root cause analysis and have various different ways of documenting that. And one of the most common ways to document your problem solving is to use the A3 approach. What I do want to stress, though, is people refer to A3 as a problem solving methodology, and that's not true. A3 is, the name comes to it from the size of the piece of paper that the report is on. And it's a method for presenting information in a very succinct way. That information could be a problem-solving method or a problem-solving endeavor you've undertaken, but it could also be a project update It could be, here's a proposal for an element of the strategy that we should look at. So it could be anything. So don't confuse that with necessarily the method. And then Kaizen is something we train some of our clients in, the sort of yellow belt level. It's like a rapid improvement workshop where a team comes together, they focus on a very specific problem, and they work through some techniques to come up with what's causing it, how might we solve it, and hopefully also implement it in a really rapid fire fashion. And then when we move into the chartered improvement project space, this is where we're more likely to be seeing the sort of the Lean Six Sigma project-based approaches now, the DMAIC cycles or the PMI improvement cycle, things like strategy deployment, system leadership workshops, maybe looking at things on a broader, more complex level. So back to the structured problem solving, different techniques there. And I think we also saw Shane enlisted on the Miro board earlier. It's my view, I think they've got more in common with each other than they are different. Mm-hmm. So just some guidance on choosing a method if you don't have them in your businesses already. Leadership, I think there's a big responsibility on them to create the space and the right culture for this to happen, because all of us are all busy, and sadly, because problem solving requires some degree of investigation, sometimes people don't feel they've got time to do it, and therefore they just get trapped in that kind of firefight mentality. Practitioners, I think it's important to have the right mindset, this thing about not apportioning blame on people, but looking at processes instead. And solutions should resolve the problem forever. That's a mindset thing. So you need to think about, when we're coming up with fixes, how do we eradicate this forever, not just temporarily? And that should lead to more robust processes. PDSA is at the core of problem solving. No matter what method you're using, it's a really solid foundation mindset to have, both with regards root cause and finding the right sorts of solutions. I think we've covered on the last slide the recognition that different approaches are required in regards different levels of complexity. So you could also think about it that 3 C's, something like that, is maybe your local, small problem, daily type stuff. Things like 8D might be for more complex matters or problems that span over several areas. And then even more advanced techniques beyond that. The focus should be on the learning as much as it is on the problem, on actually solving the problem. There's an awful lot of learning that can come out of having the right approach, and that learning can then help to drive the organization in the future in terms of reflecting on, well, how could it avoid some of this stuff maybe more proactively? And so therefore it should always involve the team. I think we're a big advocate of that, because otherwise they miss out on that learning. And the learning can also help to change the culture of people being okay with the idea of admitting there's a problem and being willing to go and try and investigate it, get to the bottom of it. So success should mean that we're improving, not just maintaining the status quo. Yeah, that we're actually coming up with processes that are now more reliable because they're less likely to fail in the future. And have a battle plan. I think you can't problem solve everything. So you might need to have some criteria by which we decide, where do we use this approach versus where don't we? Another point to reflect on is maybe we have so many problems around us because we have a lack of standardization. And perhaps we should focus on that as a precursor to trying to jump into structured problem solving. I think one sets the other one up. So if you had good standardization, would you have as many things going wrong? And maybe you haven't got the time to resolve problems because of a lack of standardization. So it's kind of a vicious circle there. But any problem solving should lead to improved standards. Either you didn't have them in the first place, or you've created new ones.
Cool. Thanks, Damo. Damion mentioned earlier on that the Uncommon Sense podcast, which links to all of our activities, has a particular link here to the problem-solving tools we mentioned. In our knowledge base, you will find these episodes, each about 10-15 minutes or so, presented by a different one of our consultants, each one focusing on a different tool for improvement. I find it in the Knowledge Hub. You can also subscribe on all the major podcast services. So whatever is your favorite, just search Uncommon Sense Podcast, and one of these happy faces will appear, I am sure. So Damo, finals key points then, if you would, in the last couple of minutes before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think I've touched on most of this already. So again, I've mentioned PDSA as a central mindset, really important. There's lots of tools which work well across all those different structured methods. So the tools are pretty universal. There are lots of methods, but they all share that similar structure. Identify root cause, find a solution. Problem solving should aid improvement, not just maintain current state. And yeah, all roads lead back to standardization, as I've mentioned already. So I think that's a
So Damo, we've had a great question in from Stuart, and I'm going to propose something we haven't done before, which is I'm going to set this as an exam question for you, and ask you to answer it, and we'll send it out with the recording next week. And Stuart's question is: in engineering problem solving, it's very common to find interactions between causal factors rather than one simple cause. I've used a design of experiments successfully in these cases, but are there other tools which you have experience of which take less effort / expertise? So don't worry about answering it now. We will answer that exam question along with the text for those of you who didn't manage to write it down, because I didn't see Damien's pen twitching there. And we will send that out. So I think that's a really interesting one, and we'd really like your perspective on it, Damo. So there's a bit of an exam question for the bank holiday weekend for you. And finally, folks, from us, we have got next month coming up with my colleague Warren Knight. What's the size of the prize? We've talked about problem solving, we've talked about improvement context, we've talked about visualizing your processes and problems. Next month, we're talking about tools to identify and measure your impact. Show us the money, in other words. We're going to explore the critical components of measuring impact, the tools that will help you track your benefits, and how to capture and share learning to maximize those results, some of which Damo's touched on today. 26th of May, 1500 UK time. Register now at pmi.co.uk/webinars. And finally, just a reminder of all the thought leadership content we've mentioned today. Find it at pmi.co.uk in the Knowledge Hub. So all that is remaining to do is say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It is, as always, a pleasure to have you with us. We genuinely love doing these things, and it's our privilege to be able to do so. Do follow us on all the channels. Look out for us on LinkedIn, and you will get a recording next week. For those of you in the UK, enjoy your long weekend. We will not hold you back any longer. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.